Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Although today, Chris has promised to take us beyond CMMC into some other interesting realms of supply chain risk. My guest today, Chris Nissen from MITRE. I want to mention to the audience that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations seeking certification under CMMC, and that's who we have mostly in our audience today. We'll say if you're in the audience and you have some questions for Chris, please send them in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll ask as many of those questions as I can. I'll start with an introduction. Chris is not a stranger to the series. Was on here in September, talking to us about some of his work at MITRE, and back again today with an update. Chris is the director of Asymmetric Threat Response and Supply Chain Security in the Special Concepts Group at the MITRE Corporation. He's been with MITRE since the mid-90s, working on big data analytics, some intelligence projects he probably can't tell us much about, critical infrastructure protection. Chris is the co-author of the Deliver Uncompromised report from 2018, which plays a really central role in the origin story of CMMC. And lately, he's been working on a new book about how our adversaries might exploit our supply chains and how we can do a better job defending against those attacks. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Chris, let's start with your book. Tell us about that. What can we expect? What's it about? Why should we buy a copy?
Well, I don't know the when yet. It's a big project. One of the things I'm doing with it is kind of unusual, and then I'm trying to target two audiences. That is maybe the first third or so of the book to the C-suite, because it's going to go, it's beyond the DIB. I think, your talk last week, Bill Stevens, a good friend of mine, he did a good job of laying out this is a whole of nation, whole of society problem. So give the C-suites out there some ammunition to kind of think about the problem differently and motivate them. I've been working with two companies that their CEOs read Deliver Uncompromised and said, we're changing the way we approach security in our company. So I want to hit that audience. And then the other 2/3 is sort of like, the other vice presidents or director level and below that have to do the implementation. I think I've talked to many people in the industry where, they're down here and they're going up and asking for resources. And if it's not appreciated down here, they don't necessarily get it. So I think targeting both of those is really, really important. And I just offer, if there's anyone on here, I think it's also important. I try to spend a lot of time in the private sector talking to both of those target audiences. But I think it's important to, really have your thumb on the pulse, I guess, or finger on the pulse of the wide variety of challenges going on in the boardrooms and in the C-suites, and how they're worrying or dealing with what I call unknown operational risk in their entities. So if anyone would like to be interviewed either on the record or off the record, please reach out to me. Elizabeth can get you my email, or you can link with me on LinkedIn. And I think it's really intended to bring greater awareness and some principles and some tangible actions. For instance, I think one of the most interesting things that'll come out of it is how to monetize that risk. I've talked a little bit about that before, but trying to develop that. At the end of the day, these companies are in business to make money, and every dollar counts. And they all have a risk appetite. So I think it's important to have a risk monetization model that spans. I have a wide appetite for risk, and I'm gonna gamble. To I have almost no appetite for risk. And wherever you're at on that spectrum, it's important for the C-suite to own that. And it helps you make more intelligent and informed resource allocation decisions.
Well, I'll say for sure, we have both members of your target audience in our audience today. So members of the C-suite, a lot of practitioners that are out there doing security, cybersecurity on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, maybe people are interested in participating in the process, in Chris's writing process, reach out. So Chris, it seems like some of the recent events have made this topic even more timely, right? Solar wind situation keeps unfolding. There's sort of more layers to it than I think we imagined. Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, maybe a little more straightforward in terms of what's going on there, but still impactful. Is that changing anything about what you were going to write about, or is that just throwing more logs on the fire, so to speak?
No, it's actually proving the model out that I put together a long time ago. It's proving it to be correct in the public eye, which is really important. And it addresses that. Remember how I define supply chain is cyber IT, cyber OT, formal supply chain, software, hardware, services, product, if you're not dealing with hardware, software, and then the human element. And I do that because, again, that's called a blended operation and counterintelligence, and the adversary moves in and out of there, those vectors. And SolarWinds, and then what happened again with some of the, well, not just the attack, the ways the attacks that are taking place, but then some of the solutions you see people putting forward, they're clearly not recognizing that model, even though that's how the adversary may be behaving. So no, it's not so much adding fuel. I do think it helps add a sense of urgency because we need to react, but knee-jerk reactions that put undue burdens on industry, for instance, are not good for anybody. So you got to think this through a principles-based approach. So it's just confirming original thoughts.
Let me dive in a little bit to SolarWinds, Microsoft, the two biggest news events, I guess, in terms of this year. So, what we've seen with Microsoft has been widespread exploitation of their on-premise email products. These are software flaws. They weren't planted by an adversary like was the case in SolarWinds. At least it doesn't seem to be the case. These are just flaws that existed from development, but were discovered and are now being exploited. But what we've seen is that the exploitation is really broad and really faster than patches can be applied. So is that, if you think about that compared to SolarWinds, is this the same kind of supply chain risk, or are these kind of fundamentally different risks? I mean, they're both deep in the supply chain with things that have this sort of widespread use and a sort of implicit trust, right? We buy from Microsoft, we buy from SolarWinds, we all use it in a very trusted way, meaning right in the guts of our operation.
Well, actually, it hits several of the core principles that I'm encouraging everyone to think about. You hit it. One was trust. It is a vulnerability, whether it's placed there deliberately or not, right? So in the risk equation, threat, vulnerability, consequence, the vulnerability can be inherent or introduced. So in SolarWinds, it was introduced. In Microsoft, maybe it was inherent. Nonetheless, it's a vulnerability. They're going to exploit it, but it's easier for them to exploit if it's already sitting there. If that's got advantages and disadvantages. The other thing it points out, though, is that I like to think of the fallacy of trust. I don't like to see things. I think it's a mistake to call something trusted unless you're continuously monitoring it. And the group that did the trust is much broader than a handful of people that do whatever certification or that they need to do and say this is now clean, because that just is very attractive to an adversary. Because once something's trusted, then they can activate a vulnerability that's already there, or really go after getting one in. And they can do that through those other vectors I talked about, including the human element, right? So SBOM wouldn't have fixed SolarWinds because it's an attractive target because it's trusted and it's common. So if they couldn't have got in, and there's reports it could have come in through a third-party product, like JetBrains, I think was one I read about. It could have come in through a phishing attack, but it could also come in by an insider, witting or unwitting. So the point is that one of the I think the MOs that we're seeing, certainly out of Russia, and increasingly I think from all actors, is, and it's what makes this asymmetric, is the fact that they can put in a little bit of effort and get a huge footprint. So of course, Microsoft is going to be a huge target because they've got that huge footprint. SolarWinds was little known to people outside network management, but it was there. And even if you go to SolarWinds website, you know, they talk about consolidating. Their whole market pitch was consolidating 3 different layers of enterprise management in the one. Ah, great. That's what the adversary likes. So what you find is that you're a target, the more widespread. Kaspersky went after the root of the hard disk, saying, I'll protect it. They did that, and then they have the equivalent of Google search over 500 million hard disks. That's a huge vulnerability. It's a huge intelligence asset to have. So any system that has that is going to be a target. Now, what do you do about it? And by the way, I like to say that efficiency equals fragility, but diversity really points to resilience. And what I mean by that is it may be efficient to collapse those layers. It may be efficient for the DIB to say, we'd like everybody to be on O365 if you're a DIB contractor, but you're driving fragility into the system and creating targets. Whereas diversity does the opposite. It makes it harder for the adversary to operate at scale. There's some other concepts I would bring into it. One, I guess, is due diligence and transparency of commercial software. So I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but you know, one article I read said, you know, this may have come, you know, the initial hook may have come from a product called JetBrains that SolarWinds was using in their build environment. That transparency and maybe due diligence, in my view, it's just my opinion, was probably lacking. It was my understanding from reading the open source, it was a Czechoslovakian company with Russian backers. Not that all Czechoslovakian companies are bad, not that all Russian backers are bad, but it should warrant a little more attention to be paid to say, well, let's make sure, maybe let's really watch this product or something, you know, do some due diligence on it. But by no means is this only happening in industry. I see it in the government. I won't name any organizations or any products, but you know, I was kind of dumbfounded to see for one particular application, you know, an American company that was partnered with China, and all of the information was in the Chinese cloud for a national kind of asset. And you ask the question, who's done the due diligence? You know, who checked that out? I mean, you could hear a pin drop. So I think that beware of trust. Recognize that although efficiencies, you know, the IC, the DNI Clapper several years ago consolidated all of our intelligence systems into one called iSight. And one of the primary motivations was cost savings. But you just put a huge target on those systems. And one of those, you know, I think they end up running on AWS servers. So you see then in the news, well, Supermicro is a target. Wow, I wonder why. If those blades are used, you've made that target, you've made that service, which you did for cost efficiency, so juicy as a target that is well worth the risk and reward of the top professionals in an adversary government. And did you really end up saving that cost in the long run if there's a compromise? So that's got to come into that risk monetization model that I'm talking about.
So Chris, a minute ago you mentioned SBOM wouldn't have prevented SolarWinds. So I'll translate that. Software bill of materials. What does software bill of materials solve? What does it not solve in terms of looking at that as how we go about vetting and trusting software we're going to buy and use?
And don't get me wrong, SBOM is a good thing. It needs to be done. I completely back what NTIA and industry is doing there. But the approach needs to be layered. So SBOM, software bill of materials, 90% of the software written is built on open source code. Very, very few people are writing code from scratch. So it's assembled, much like you would assemble, you know, a mechanical device. Or an electrical device. Software, then there's different instantiations of it, but the general concept is saying when it's assembled and it's assembled by the manufacturer, call it the manufacturer, the developer. It's given sort of, think of it as a immutable hash that, okay, we know what's in it, right down to the firm. Well, it's not firmware in this case, in the code. Maybe obviously out of the compiler, you could do earlier steps in the software build. But then as that's distributed, now it can't be messed with. You know that what you received came from the manufacturer that way, and that you can do the same thing with upgrades and everything else. The problem is, the reason it wouldn't have fixed it is, like I said, the insider, right? If you've got a developer to go bad, wittingly or unwittingly, and he's on, think of it like a classified communication system. You got a red side and a black side. The world sees the black side, the classified information is on the red side. Well, if you're on the red side of that equation and you get it injected into the build, then okay, it's got to start that it's coming out as trusted again. So you need layered security, and the principles I'm laying out are talking about, not putting all your eggs in one basket. SBOM wouldn't have prevented SolarWinds.
Let me ask a little bit about information sharing. So especially about threat activities, what's effective, what's working, what's not. In our defensive measures. I think it's really critical that we have good avenues, and people have talked about this in terms of business to business, business to government. Watching the early sharing of information that FireEye did when SolarWinds started to be discovered was a really great example of the value of sharing in terms of getting information in people's hands really early, really quickly. But I mean, I've said before, FireEye is an outlier, both in terms of their willingness to be transparent and their level of knowledge. I mean, this is an expert security company that was able to see and observe and make sense of some things that I think few companies would be capable of doing. So CMMC doesn't really have anything in it that addresses information sharing directly, but there are some ways we can incentivize that and enable better sharing amongst the DIB and other parts of the supply chain. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how do we cause that to be the norm rather than the exception?
Well, as a matter of fact, that is one of the recommendations that came right out of Deliver on Compromise when we recommended that there be something that we called the National Supply Chain Intelligence Center. And I modeled that after NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, which was stood up because of lack of information sharing pre 9/11 between different government departments and agencies. So NCTC kind of flattened that, brought them all together, and information intelligence was, jointly worked on, took those walls down. There's no such thing in this broader asymmetric threat. It's been 2.5 years, but believe it or not, there is some movement in that direction. I think Bill Stevens, in your talk last week, I recommend anyone who didn't see it to go back. He was very, very good about saying, look, there's only so much industry can do. I agree, and that they should inform, assist, and interact with the government. The flip side of that coin is I also believe that, especially as we move from signature-based vulnerabilities to signature-less based vulnerabilities like SolarWinds was, that the real future of a lot of that intelligence is actually in the private sector. It's in infrastructure that the government doesn't own, really can't easily touch. So it's really important that the private sector begin to recognize that and develop means of finding it themselves. Now it's how do we share what I think I can guarantee it's a huge mistake for anyone not in the government to look at the government and say, wow, if we could just get that classified briefing, we'd be all set. You'd be sorely disappointed in my opinion. And I think that that's going to continue to increase. That's not to say that, yeah, some esoteric thing can be picked up on SIGINT or something. Sure, that's going to happen once in a while. But the real attacks that are happening out there are happening in the private sector. And that's good for a company that discovers it for other companies to find it. So NSIC is one concept, and we need protections. Bill talked about that. We need to protect companies and encourage them to share. The other piece is, and as a point he and I talked about for a long time, you can't, I think he used a Wayne Gretzky analogy, you can't win if all you're doing is defending. So the North Star of deliver uncompromised was comprehensive deterrence. And the big piece of that is finding a way to fight back, not just with the keyboard. There's other means of fighting. But one of the first steps we need, I think, is a common operating picture of the infrastructure in the DIB in CONUS. And, our adversaries know very well where to snuggle up between authorities and policies. And as soon as they land on American soil, it gets very difficult for anybody outside of FBI. And if, there's a few other cases, but not at scale, to deal with that problem. And actually, it was probably little known, but in the NDAA last year, Congress directed SecDef to do some investigation on what they could do to help strengthen the DIB. So there is some activity going on in that arena, and I think that what's likely to come out of that is at least some potential architectures for being able to actually get, I don't want to say real time, but maybe closer to real time, of sort of the operating picture of attacks being launched against us in the United States. And I'll say right there, to do that, it's going to take public sector and private sector to come together in a trusted way. And it might not be directly with the government. It might be a third-party entity that's trusted, and there's constructs for that. But I think in the meantime, until those, I'm aware of some pilots that are going on now with some really big contractors. I think in the meantime, private entities, especially those that realize that they're a target, starting to build the capability to, realize that in a way they're sitting on top of some of that intelligence, and they need to start kind of, for their own defense, finding a way to kind of get ahead of that a little bit.
Cool. So how does CMMC tie into this? So we think about deliver uncompromised as kind of the genesis of CMMC, but there's a lot more there. So I mean, CMMC, first of all, it's a spectacular outcome if it is in fact an outcome of that report, because it's having very widespread impact on thinking and actions within the contractor community. But I've heard you say CMMC is just a tiny part of the picture. For contractors, I would say CMMC is taking up a huge percentage of their mind share right now. It's a lot to absorb. It's causing some fundamental changes, again, in security and IT management. What else should people be thinking about if they want to take a moment for the big picture? What beyond CMMC should be on their mind? Yeah, I think
What I've always liked to say is it's CMMC is necessary but not sufficient. There's a number of things. I mean, in addition to this attack vector that I looked at with the companies that I consult with, or two, you lay out. Remember, it's important for everybody to remember that, in my view, this asymmetric era started in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's when Russia and China said, we don't want to take the United States on kinetically. The United States really didn't realize that. In my view, some of us started to realizing it after the OPM breach. But that was quite a while ago now. So they've got more than a couple decades. So it's going to take us a while to fix that. But there's things you can do in the short, medium, and long term. One of the things is that if you're a target, and I'll talk a little bit about that if you like, but if you're a target, kind of how I said before, especially if an attack against you would give them scale, then you need to move to means of continuous monitoring. So with the companies I'm consulting with, they look at those vectors, they look at those attack vectors, and one of them will say, we really don't know our people that well. And this is a DIB entity, only 30, 40% are cleared. The rest of them, they manufacture stuff. They're not cleared. So we didn't even really look at them that much. We're going to stand up an insider risk program. That's great. They kind of looked at the whole thing, and that's what's keeping the CEO up. Then that's the thing you should go after first, because you do have to do a risk assessment and where are they most likely to come in. Others are saying, we've grown so much over the last several years. We've bought up so many companies. We really don't know who's in our supply chain, and maybe we've even got redundancy. Maybe we've got systemic risk because we don't know, because those companies bought other companies. We could end up being, paying down two different routes and also exposing ourselves to different. So they're going after really understanding their supply chain in terms of who's in it. But the lesson to learn there is not only layering by looking at that, but that the adversary is never going to just go away. Right? I mean, if you're a target, you're a target. And as I said in SolarWinds, if they couldn't get in through one way, then they'll get in another way because it's just too juicy to not go after. So that requires at least a strategic roadmap for that layered kind of defense for the areas that you feel you're most vulnerable in, as well as continuous monitoring at least some periodicity. So CMMC right now, I've heard no answers to my question as well. How often are you going to have to be recertified? What happens in between certifications, even in the cyber realm. And I think that's an important piece of this. I'm less worried about that with CMMC because you're required to have if you're a DIB contractor anyways, you're required to have a cybersecurity plan, a reaction plan and everything. That's fantastic. And it's going to do a lot to closing up some really wide open gaping holes that are out there. But not thinking in a static sense, but thinking in a fluid sense with how the adversary is reacting is key.
I want to ask a couple of audience questions on the topic of risk risk monetization that you talked about earlier. So two here on different sides of my screen. Cost avoidance can be one flavor of monetization. The cybersecurity insurance industry is a key stakeholder in the ecosystem. Better risk management reduces risks and can lower premiums. How powerful of an influence do you see underwriters and brokers going forward? And do you have any best practices for organizations in their cyber insurance plans and strategies?
That's going to take a lot more than we have time for. But
the 2 minutes we have left. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. I did spend a little over 45 hours, I think, right around the time I was writing Deliver and Compromise, talking to underwriters and brokers, a little bit in New York, a lot in London. London is much better at viewing systemic risk. And I'll tell you, it's really in its infancy. The general consensus there is it's a huge moneymaker right now. I think they are interested in, I'll say two things. One is the industry itself is concerned about systemic risk. I mean, just imagine if, and I don't know that it's going to happen at all, but imagine if SolarWinds is kind of found liable, right? And it's got its, the exploit in a large number of companies that are underwritten by a single insurance company. There are companies in London that they're convinced that there's going to be a black swan event in the industry itself at some point. It kind of makes sense, right? But to the second part of the question, I think it's as you're leaning more forward in your own company. I found that the insurance industries that we were talking with very open to negotiation because they're not even quite sure how to price this. It's nothing that they've ever had to deal with before. And it's not the be all because many of them have language in there about an act of war, making the policy invalid. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be hard. It's going to be very difficult when the government says, "Hey, we think this is from Russia." Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Act of war. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be the panacea. I think it'll play a role, but it's still too early.
Let me get one more audience question, and then I'll ask a wrap up to close things out here today. So this is a more open-ended version of that a little bit. But how can the DoD encourage the DIB to make security a priority? Presently, it's an overhead cost and minimally funded at that. So how do we, that risk monetization? How do we shift that so that people might view it as something other than a cost avoidance, like the earlier question was stating?
Yeah, well, it's really easy. They could follow the first recommendation and deliver on compromise and make security the fourth acquisition decision with cost, schedule, and performance. They did not, and in fact, you're right. CMMC was born out of that. You know, I think the Pentagon's view was that security is so important; it needs to be baseline, it needs to be foundational, and hence the best thing we can do is stand up what eventually was called CMMC, and it's going to set a cybersecurity baseline. It apparently missed the little footnote in Deliver on Compromise that talked about the blended attack vector. Great, you know, and I used to say you can wave a wand over the cyber piece, but and magically make it 100% secure. They're still going to get in through these other vectors. So that is the single greatest thing. You know, if until certainly in the Pentagon says, you know, we're cost, schedule, and performance are important, but counterintelligence security and risk, that's where the whole name Deliver on Compromise comes from. You know, it was a challenge to say, show me something that we've delivered that's not compromised. Until you do that, then you know, you're making it hard. I do think, though, for the private sector, I do think the time is coming, even if you're almost 100% on government work, that the time is coming where you're not going to be able to ignore supply chain risk. We're at the same point that cyber IT might have been in the early 90s, where, yeah, it's nice, I really don't understand it. I like to think of it as, you know, for those of who are, familiar with Adam Smith's invisible hand, everything we're dealing with is following that rule, that if you let price discovery happen and quality and frictionless in commerce, that the market discovers, but it's all based on trust. I argue that, you know, we're really in an invisible battle where that hand is being exploited. And it's when you start to realize that, then you start to realize, whoa, you know, I think the point is going to come where creditors, investors, the risk committee, the audit committee of the board of directors, the customers below you, even if you're a DIB contractor, and above you if you're a sub, and the consumers, if you're not, aren't going to be happy with the fact that I've given you money and I'm depending on you, and you're telling me that my money's got huge risk I didn't know about. You're telling me that I use your product and I'm bringing your risks into my enterprise. I think that we're on the dawn of that. And I think that's really the fuel that's under the fire for supply chain security today.
Agree. And I wish we had time to hear more about the magic wand that's going to make cyber 100%.
Oh, yeah, no.
But we unfortunately, we do not have time for that revelation. So you'll have to tune in a future session where Chris will tell us how that works. Let me ask a wrap-up question, Chris, to get this actionable for folks in the audience. I'd like to ask for your one suggestion for business leaders in our audience, action they can take today to start to address this broad range of risk that we've talked about.
I'd say, you know, and you may or may not have people in your organization that can help you do this. If not, then as Bill and you discussed last week, you said something like, it seems like we need counterintelligence people involved. Yeah, I think you do, because we're up against nation states. That said, however, you have to get that thinking, and it can be a consultant, is you have to, you know, try to look at your industry, exactly where you fit in, and you know, try to determine how big of a target you are in the larger ecosystem, and then within wherever you're at, and that could be the program, right? I mean, it could be the program, the United States government, if you're a DIB contractor, the program that you're providing, supporting, you know, if you're a cleared contractor, you know, there are a list of, you know, critical technologies and critical capabilities that the government tries to protect. So you can easily look at what they think, but you can also just sort of step back and look at the ecosystem. And I kind of think of it as, you know, even video calls today are huge, in my view, are a huge target. Why? Because, you know, if you've got an entity here that is a collection, a technical collection or intelligence collection activity, what do they try to do? Like I said, they go after things that have leverage. Kaspersky, Marriott for pattern of life and personal information, OPM for a whole number of reasons. But even video calls. I mean, what a nice opportunity for an adversary to try to get inside of, and then they see who's talking to whom. They don't even have to collect what the conversations are. Just the metadata is worth a lot. Oh, the CEO of this little company is having a Teams call or Zoom call or whatever it is with this company. That's interesting. I wonder if there's something going on there. Why don't we look at that metadata and now drop surveillance on it? So that's why, SolarWinds was not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise if you think about it. Exchange should not be a surprise. It's just too valuable to not go after. So kind of do that assessment and then step back and say, okay, do we believe with our risk appetite, do we have a problem or not? Because you are targeted to some degree. So that's I don't see many companies thinking of themselves that way. And usually when I get done talking to them for a few hours, they're pretty concerned. Like I said, especially in the DIB, we've got a lot of companies that have mission assurance departments. That is, they understand that if we can stop using this $50 part and drop it down to a $25 part, we can maintain the same mean time between failure, develop redundancy or whatever in the system, and save money and still meet the performance guidelines. What they don't understand is that they've got this unknown operational risk hanging out there. So it's very appropriate for the management of a company to try to recognize what is that unknown risk and how can I get my hands around it.
That's good advice. So think really hard about how and why you might be targeted, right? What are those specifics that are unique to you? Well, Chris, we're out of time. We're a little bit over our time. Thanks very much. It was excellent information, good food for thought. I want to thank you. I want to thank Wade Forbes, who's been creating a visual record of this in real time. And for those in the audience, we'll send you a copy of that after, as soon as Wade sends us a snapshot of it. Thanks for joining us today. Please join us for future town hall meetings. Our next session, we're going to reel it back into CMMC with Jeff Dalton from the CMMC Accreditation Body Board of Directors. He's going to fill us in on the latest developments there. That's going to be March 17th at our regular time of 1 p.m. Eastern. And then on March 24th, we're going to have an auditor C3PAO perspective with Stuart Itkin from Coal Fire Federal. So please tune in for those. Again, bringing it back more on CMMC centric for the next couple of sessions. But we have definitely had some really good discussions the last few weeks, looking at the bigger picture about what our adversaries are doing in supply chain risk. So hope everybody's enjoying it. Thanks very much and have a good day.
Thanks.